gallery. Okay, so we've got over 60 people on so far. I think we can begin. So welcome everybody. Resisting the war industry on campus. That is the topic of our webinar this evening. Just before introducing the speakers, what they have to tell us, given the important work that they're doing, and that is sponsored by the War Network. This is a network of organizations across the various war companies. General Dynamics, Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed, Grumman, especially the big ones. It turns out that there are country focused on these big companies, either their weapons production or trying to stop their influence over U.S. foreign policy or whatever. And we decided these groups should kind of work together when they can. And so back in the spring, we had a national day of actions, about 20 or 25 different parts of the country, groups in different parts of the country did some type of action around war company. And we tried to give that day of action visibility. And so this webinar comes out of our thinking and our strategizing that we've been involved in since then. We've done quite a bit of very interesting webinars on war industries that some of you may have seen. If you haven't seen them, they're on the Mass Peace Action YouTube page, and you can pick them up there again. But we thought that we really should figure out a way to connect our anti-war projects focused on these companies to younger people, and to make this more of an intergenerational movement. It turns out that younger people, as you'll hear tonight, are already working on these issues, and some of us just didn't know about it. And so we want to encourage that development and give our groups in the War Industries Resistance Network ideas about how to connect up with campuses in their localities and with campus activists. And so one way of doing that is campaign to look at the portfolios that these universities hold. Universities have portfolios that include stock and other securities in these war companies. And so one idea for collaboration with people on campus would be through divestment campaigns focused. This has worked, as you all are aware, quite well with energy companies, fossil fuel companies, and divestment efforts that have gone on there. Big, for instance. In war companies, not as much. And we're hoping to spread this idea. So to help us with this idea, to shape up this idea of divestment campaigns as a possible avenue for collaborative work with student groups, we've got right now. I'll mention Lillian Malden is a founding board member of Women for Weapons Trade Transparency. Isn't that amazing that such a group exists? This is a growing cohort of scholars, students, and activists committed to producing quality research on international weapons sales and advocating for corporate and government divestment from war. Their first focus has been on divestment of war company holdings of the University of Texas and Texas A&M company, which is it's called UTIMCO. This is the largest public endowment fund in the U.S. And Women for Weapons Trade Transparency has been mobilizing student governance bodies at the University of Texas in Austin. Graduate Student Assembly, student government, and Senate of College councils to develop support for University of Texas system divestment from weapons manufacturers. So this is right up our alley, and we want to hear about this. Lillian is joined tonight by her colleague, Rosie Kahn, a fellow founding board member of Women for Weapons Trade Transparency. So we're going to start with Lillian, and we're looking forward to hearing your story.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all for being here. This is a really great turnout. I'm really excited to talk to y'all about our work, what we've done, how we've built our campaign, and how, if you're interested in starting a similar campaign at an institution that you are a stakeholder in, how you might do that. So I'm going to go ahead and share a few slides, and we will run through those together. So again, my name's Lillian. Rosie's here with me today, and we'll be presenting alongside myself. We're both founding board members of Women for Weapons Trade Transparency. So a little bit about us, how we formed. In July 2020, several undergraduate students at University of Texas at Austin joined together just to kind of explore the University of Texas at Austin's investments in weapons manufacturers. And today we're a nationally registered nonprofit. We promote transparency of international weapons and arms trade. We do a lot of investigative research using FOIA. If you know, you know. We collaborate extensively on research projects, activism campaigns, and organizational development. And we envision a world in which the manufacture, sale, and use of arms and weapons of war has drastically decreased, where inter and intrastate conflicts are mitigated peacefully, and where every human being is safe, secure, and free from oppression. I also want to mention that we do have members across the country as well that are in constant collaboration with us. So we are not just UT based anymore. Most of our members have since graduated. So we are really kind of collaborating across states at the moment. So for some background on this campaign specifically and what UTIMCO is, UTIMCO again stands for the University of Texas and Texas A&M Investment Management Company. As of August 2021, which was when their most recent report on the Permanent University Fund was released, they hold approximately $63 million worth of weapons manufacturers and weapons systems manufacturers, debt and equity securities, just in their Permanent University Fund. And so, of course, the UT system has a mission statement to improve the human condition in Texas, our nation, and the world. And UTIMCO has a stated commitment to eradicate poverty and advance society. And we, of course, are of the belief that these investments are running directly counter to these stated missions and goals. So I'm sure if you're on this call, you're aware of kind of the larger global issue. The United States sells weapons and weapon systems to many international customers, many of which are complicit in contributing to warmongering, loss of human life, humanitarian crisis. So as of 2020, UTIMCO invests in 16 different weapons manufacturers. A lot of these companies manufacture cluster munitions, landmines, white phosphorus, nuclear weapons, all of which have treaties or conventions in place to prohibit or restrict their use. They also invest in companies that produce autonomous weapons, which have received a lot of condemnation for their inaccuracy, their bias, and really just taking the life and death decisions out of the hands of humans and putting them in the hands of robots, essentially. And then I'll hand it over to Rosie to discuss kind of our campaign timeline and how we went about building all of this out.
Great. Thank you so much, Lillian, for the background and introduction. And thank you, Paul, for bringing us here. So as Lillian and Paul said, my name is Rosie. I'm a former fellow student and colleague of Lillian. I just graduated from UT Austin this past May. And so we're going to walk you through what our campaign timeline looked like and the different ways we went about gathering all the information we needed and garnering support. So between September and December of 2020, we were researching and compiling resources on UTIMCO's investments in weapon manufacturers, as well as the institution's investment policies. And so we looked at published detailed schedules of investments on the Permanent University Fund, which are available on UTIMCO's website because it's a public endowment fund. And then we prepared our campaign for its public launch by making lists of potential supporters among fellow students, among faculty, among people in the press and the student newspaper, as well as people at different campuses in the UT system and people across the A&M system. And then in January 2021, this was our month of very active movement building. So this was contacting those UT system students, alumni, different NGOs, and then writing a joint resolution draft, then gathering co-sponsors of the legislation and contacting UTIMCO. So this joint resolution was presented to UT Austin student governance bodies. There are three, which Paul had named. There is student government, the Senate of College Councils, and the Graduate Student Assembly. And so these three legislative student organizations make up the different student governance bodies in the university, which can put forward resolutions and then adopts them and make them a formal sort of statement on behalf of the entire student body. So we contacted UTIMCO 3 times, excuse me, with an ask for collaboration and to speak with them, but we got no response at that time early in the campaign. In February 2021, we publicly launched #UTIMCODivest, and we put out campaign media blasts. We released a public petition, and then we also submitted our joint resolution to go through the process in the separate student governance bodies. We also published a resource guide and all of the research on UTIMCO's investments. So this was just a publicly viewable, totally transparent, detailed spreadsheet on the different investments in separate manufacturing companies throughout many years of different permanent university investment reports, and even what page number you could find them on, so people could go through and check our work and see where all the numbers came from. And then we also reached out to potential supporters and media outlets with asks to support and publicize the campaign. And so I can drop a link here in the chat, which is an article which one of our members had published in the Baines report. And then this was in March of 2021, so it was along with the media blast. On the next slide, we wanted to give you all some visuals about what this sort of support looked like and how we were gathering and power mapping different figures who we could try and speak to directly. So what you see here is the names of the different boards, the different members of the UT System Board of Regents. And so we looked into their backgrounds and their biographies and the different companies they were associated with and all the different kind of issues they were affiliated with or had taken stances on. And then also taking a look at the different titles they had within the Board of Regents, which is the body to which the UTIMCO Board of Directors answers. That is to say, the Board of Regents is the fiduciary and the Board of Regents is the fiduciary and the UTIMCO directors are the folks who have to manage this endowment fund, and they're responsible solely to the Board of Regents, not to say any student body. And so we were targeting the people you see in the red rectangle because they were the ones who seemed most likely to be aligned with our asks and our values and to construe the issue the same way we were, as these weapon manufacturer investments going directly against the UT system's mission and values and everything they claim to value. And on the next slide, going into more depth about what has happened in the past year, we focused on building power and relationships within the UT student governance bodies. And then we managed to present our legislation in the GSA, the Senate, and the student government. And then it passed through GSA and Senate and secured that 2/3 vote from the different legislative student organizations to pass and be formally adopted as a joint resolution in the university, which means that you can say that the student body has spoken on this issue and this is what they support. And so I'm going to pause briefly to talk about a lot of the pushback that we received in student government, if you notice that student government was the one out of the three in which our resolution was actually voted down by a narrow margin. So earlier, Paul was talking about how people have been focusing a lot on Yemen as a case study for Raytheon and the damage that has been done there, all these like flagrant violations of different treaties. And we also brought up Yemen in our report and mentioned it in the joint resolution text to showcase how Raytheon is a company that, among others like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, have had all of these different issues associated with them. But during the student government debate over the joint resolution text in the bill that we were presenting, we faced a lot of backlash from a certain concentrated group of students that were led by a highly conservative right-wing and Zionist student, and then as well as their sort of friends in the engineering college who had been fed misinformation and led to believe that if this bill were to go through and be adopted by the student body, that it would harm their job prospects with potential companies in the aerospace engineering field and career field beyond that. So these are kind of issues that if you or people you know are intending to start divestment campaigns at universities should know what you're getting into, because there was a lot of straw man arguments and our organization being accused of anti-Semitism because there were so many weird connections being drawn with wanting to reduce the flow of weapons into Yemen and the surrounding regions. And then the opposition and in student government accused us of being Houthi sympathizers, which was just extremely unexpected, to say the least, when we started working on our research here. And so we made a document of sort of rebuttal points in order to deal with this second round of debate in student government. And then that clarified it a lot. And I think Paul had mentioned it served as an educational tool to all of the students who were there participating or listening in the Student Government Assembly. Ultimately, it was voted down by a margin of 6 votes. But because it passed through the Graduate Student Assembly and the Senate of College Councils, it was adopted successfully as the university student body. And then in May, with the help of our allies in student government, we secured a meeting with UTIMCO themselves. And so we went there in person to their office on May 25th, 2021. And then we had a long conversation with them. Ultimately, they said that they would not be implementing our asks and policy recommendations. This was for a couple different reasons. One of them is that in terms of logistics, they claimed that, well, we found out, because this was not public knowledge, that 98% of UTIMCO's assets are actually managed externally by 300 like separate asset management firms around the world. And because of how fragmented their accounts are, the UTIMCO board of directors let us know that it would be extremely impractical for them to try to go and ask all these separate firms to exclude specific companies. And we think that that doesn't mean it's impossible. They just don't, it's inconvenient for them and they don't want to do it. And the second issue for which they refused to implement our asks is that they were concerned that it would run against their sole fiduciary responsibility to the Board of Regents, because if they were making any investment choice that wasn't purely, that had social or political influences and that wasn't solely about the financial returns, then the UTIMCO directors would be in trouble with the Board of Regents. But we think that there could be a loophole to that, because we're not asking them to invest in anything. We're asking them to divest from specific issued companies. But that was how that meeting went in May 2021. And then after that, we published our detailed report that sort of laid out all of our research and all of the numbers. And then in August, we spoke at a UT System Board of Regents virtual meeting to raise our concerns before them and to ask the Board of Regents to amend the Permanent University Fund investment policy, which is the issue that the directors had been sort of worried about their own job security if they were to do something that got them in trouble with this. The clause in question that we were asking to be removed prohibits UTIMCO from making investments, and I quote, to achieve temporal benefits for any purpose, including use of its economic power to advance social or political purposes. And because of that clause, we think that it should be sort of addressed in order for any divestment issues to go forward. And then in November of 2021, we networked and presented to the UT Austin Faculty Council, asking them to basically raise support for the different petition that we had going on, as well as reach out to their other colleagues, and then attend a potential meeting with the chancellor. And yes, so, okay. That was our timeline till this past fall semester. And then on the next slide, we're going to also showcase some more of what our experience was to show you what this was like. So these are some slides that are directly taken from our May 25th, 2021 presentation to UTIMCO. And so it's over a year old, the numbers that you're seeing here, but this is what we showed to them because we wanted to speak their language and pitch divestment to them, showing them that it was not something that was going to be any harmful decision to the returns on the investment fund, which is ultimately what they're very concerned about. So we did a close look on these 6 companies, and we singled them out because they have over 60% of their revenue coming from arms sales. And that's according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute from 2019. And then I ran the numbers, again, this is from May 2021, but we calculated their 5-year returns annualized. And then we also put the proportion of the permanent university fund that they make up. And so those long decimals you're seeing show that these companies are not playing a really big role in the portfolio as a whole. So on the next slide, you can see that we're taking those same 5-year returns and then comparing them at the bottom of this table to the returns on the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones. These companies, which we were specifically targeting and asking that they divest from with priority, are underperforming compared to the main indexes. And so, and it's also underperforming compared to the average returns for UTIMCO's endowments. On the next slide, you'll see that with these large patterns of zeros coming and going across the years, because we analyzed reports going back to 1998, that weapon manufacturers are not a staple of the portfolio. And over time, the different managers of the fund have chosen to divest from these companies for what other reasons. And this shows that it wouldn't be necessarily harmful to the fund to simply screen out these companies permanently. Okay, and then with that, I will hand it back over to Lillian to continue showcasing some of the information that we pitched to UTIMCO when we spoke to them.
Thank you, Rosie. Still in awe every time I hear you run through these things, even though I've heard it a million times. But yeah, so again, on the kind of speaking UTIMCO's language, we also really drove home to them that they are being exposed to a lot of financial, legal, and reputational risk through these investments, which I think is, you know, something to highlight to whatever entity you're asking to divest. So, you know, of course, the international law ramifications, the international controversy ramifications of investing in these companies are really significant. And UTIMCO is actually pretty behind compared to a lot of similar sized institutions. Granted, most of those institutions are based in Europe, and there are not a lot of comparable US-based institutions that have divested from weapons manufacturers, but there still is significant risk and precedent for divestment that UTIMCO has not quite caught up to. So yeah, really just driving home all the other risks to your institution, I think, is really helpful as well. But the following slides we presented to UTIMCO as well. We, you know, took some pictures of relatively recent stories of you know, lawsuits, controversy, and all of these companies are ones that UTIMCO is currently invested in. So you can see Airbus here, Raytheon, this is 2020, pretty recent. General Dynamics, 2014, a little less recent. Northrop Grumman, Booz Allen Hamilton, BAE Systems, and Lockheed Martin 4 different times. And, you know, people are aware that this is not going to be their last settlement, as well as evidenced by that title in the top right corner. So I think just, you know, making sure that you're hitting kind of those cornerstones of legal reputational risk, return on investment risk, I think is really helpful for, again, speaking your institution's language of, what are they getting out of the divestment? And then I'll just touch on divestment precedent as well. I mentioned that briefly earlier, but just showing, if your institution has a history of divestment from any other industry, maybe they divested from fossil fuels. Maybe they have something in their investment policy that prohibits them from investing in certain sectors for ethical, moral reasons. Really, drawing on that, saying, okay, well, surely this can be applied to weapons as well, or to another sector that you're asking them to divest from. We did find evidence of that in UTIMCO's investment history, having to do with sanctions. And then also, again, comparing, finding similar institutions to the one that you are targeting. You want to make sure they're similar in size. Again, not a lot of similar public institutions to UTIMCO, because they are the largest in the US. But really just kind of making them, feel a little less great about their performance in comparison to their competitors can be a helpful strategy. And then Rosie, if you wanted to talk about kind of our really specific granular ask to UTIMCO, we also presented this to them in our May meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And so our specific asks, which we made to UTIMCO, were, again, speaking their language and how it would function for them would be to adopt certain screens on companies that they might invest in, to basically no more stocks or bonds in companies which manufacture this 6 things, or rather 5 things: landmines, cluster munitions, white phosphorus, autonomous weapons. So that's like, robot led and things like that, nuclear weapons, and then any companies which obtain 60% or more of their revenue from arms sales. And then we wanted them to implement this within, I think, like a 9-month time or like a 6-month time frame, but that was back then. And so we're going to be obviously changing that goalpost now. And then to issue a public statement or press release in the UT system like news, or to just issue a public statement from the Board of Regents directly explaining why this decision was made and how it was going to affect or not affect aspects of the endowment and the university's relations with these companies, which is negligible in our prediction, and then make a reasonable effort to reallocate funds. And this was, again, an ask. It's not something we were strictly demanding of them, this 4th point, but we just wanted to encourage them to consider that having the vast majority of these funds be redirected into like sustainable investments that, score highly in their rankings for ESG, because sectors like renewable energy, regenerative agriculture, and green mutual funds are something that would prevent this money from being redirected into other similarly harmful industries, ensuring they're not, again, reinvest into other weapon manufacturing companies. And we also shared with them some precedents and how this is actually very possible in case they hadn't been following this kind of news. We showcased how the S&P 500 ESG, which is something that tracks the S&P 500, the ordinary one, but it actually excludes companies that produce tobacco, companies not in compliance with the UN Global Compact, and companies that produce controversial weapons. And it very closely tracks and occasionally outperforms the ordinary S&P 500. So that shows that there's very little fear to be had about screening out companies like we're asking. We also talked to them about the precedent in the Norwegian Sovereign Pension Fund, which is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. At the time of that presentation, it was almost $1.3 trillion. That makes it 21 times larger than UTIMCO's $60 billion in total funds. And they have similar source money coming from oil and land resources. They also have a similar mission between a pension fund and an educational endowment fund, and that interest in making safe investments. And the Norwegian Sovereign Pension Fund excludes companies which produce weapons which violate fundamental humanitarian principles through their normal use. So they exclude companies like BAE Systems, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Airbus, Honeywell, Textron, and many more. And they name these companies on their website. And they include the reason for which they were excluded. So I can share that link here in this chat, and you should be able to, look at that for yourself. And so those were our asks to UTIMCO. And we structured them this way because we believe this was the sort of language that this institution in their roles would be most receptive to. So that concludes the overview of what our UTIMCO campaign has all been about. We also briefly wanted to touch on some of the other work which our organization has done outside of the university divestment topic, but closely related to militarization in insidious ways. So the 1122 program report evaluates the scope and impacts of this thing called the 1122 program, which is a sibling or sister program to the 1033 program, which many more people have heard of. They're both authorized under the NDAA, but the 1033 program is sort of like a surplus donation program whereby the military can directly share or donate their excess stock to local and state law enforcement agencies. But there's a lot more tracking around that program because they involve items that are already inventoried somewhere being transferred from the military to a different lower level agency. The 1122 program, however, is a federal program that allows for sort of discounted purchasing of new equipment from a catalog. And it involves 3 different federal level agencies that all seem to struggle with keeping up any record keeping on this. And so through using FOIA, we gathered over $42 million of never before seen data on equipment transfers to different police departments through the 1122 program, including things like Bearcats, which are armored vehicles, some SWAT vehicles, surveillance gear, and some like shooting range training for police departments. And really it demonstrated this lack of consistent record keeping and transparency and demonstrating the issues with the FOIA process. This report was cited by a report by the American Friends Service Committee, and our research, which filled this gap in knowledge, resulted in an amendment to the NDAA to restrict transfers under 1122, and that amendment is currently passing through the House. And with that, we will end our presentation, and thank you all so much. If you're interested in starting a divestment campaign at your institution and you have any questions at all, feel free to message Lillian and myself in this chat. You can send us your email address and we will be in contact with you, or you can email w2t2.org@gmail.com and we can add you into a Slack workspace where we sort of keep all of our allies together.
Well, thank you very much, Rosie and Lillian. That's pretty impressive. And I'm sure some of our folks here have questions to ask of you. And I know I do myself, but first let's go to Anna. Anna is here in Boston. Anna Milosevic is a organizer with United Against War and Militarism, and has been involved in anti-imperialist struggles at universities across Boston. She has helped organize several protests at Boston University, Northeastern, Tufts, and MIT career fairs, where war profiteers try to recruit students. We work very closely here in Boston, our Raytheon anti-war campaign. Anna's group, United Against War and Militarism, is one of the founding members of that campaign. And so we've been fortunate to work with their members at various colleges, mainly focused on recruiting. So I'd ask Anna to talk about student activism and how off-campus groups, in her opinion, how off-campus groups like the members of our network, the War Industry Resistors Network, might be able to work together with campus activists. So, Anna, given your experience over these recent years on these issues, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here. So before I get into some of what Paul is talking about, I just wanted to start off with speaking to this idea that a lot of people have about universities as a sort of neutral sanctuary, if you will, for independent thought and expression. When in reality, universities are a key cog in the wheel of the system and the oppression that is exhibited by that system, whether it's here in the United States or abroad. And these institutions supply both the research that is necessary for the war machine to function, and also the people who operate it at the end of the day, whether they're in a private company, such as a war profiteer, or they're in the government itself. These people are trained and indoctrinated at these universities to perpetuate this ideology that contributes to endless wars, and so on and so forth. So with that, just to give a little overview of one of the key ways that the war machine manifests at universities, and one of the ways that we've been able to organize and galvanize opposition to it on campus has been, as Paul said, war profiteers recruiting on campuses. And so throughout the past few years, in particular before COVID, because unfortunately COVID sort of derailed the campus career fairs in general, we protested various career fairs at BU Tufts, Northeastern, MIT, and disrupted them in various ways, and including either entering the campus recruitment event itself and protesting in front of, we protested in front of a Raytheon booth one time, or protesting in the vicinity outside of the building. At Northeastern, I believe we were so loud that they shut all the blinds and shut all the windows. So we were able to disrupt these key opportunities for war profiteers to really reach students. And in the process, obviously, primarily met other students on campus that were interested. And one of the key things that we emphasized was that these companies are coming and trying to sell students on this farce of, come work at a diverse workplace. We stand for LGBT rights, all this sort of stuff, come tackle challenging new problems. And so our role is really, and I think the role of students is to expose what these companies are actually doing. What is the oppression that they're doing and helping facilitate abroad and at home. So that's one of the key ways that we've been able to organize with outside groups, myself included, and Mass Peace Action and other groups as well, and coming together for those protests. But I also wanted to just speak to a couple of other areas of the war machine and how it touches other issues. So besides the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, and direct Department of Defense research, which are very explicitly targeted towards the military and the war machine, there's these other elements of it, such as intelligence and surveillance, that also are part and parcel to the system, and universities play a key role in that. So just as an example, here in Boston, Northeastern University was designated a National Security Agency Center of Excellence in Cyber Operations, where students take NSA-run seminars, they get temporary jobs, and they get training for careers in cybersecurity. So what that roughly translates to is people that are getting training on how to spy on the general public and suppress dissent here and in general. And I think that in particular touches so many different issues. It's not necessarily just that they're targeting those that oppose their endless wars, but also people that oppose ICE or are in favor of Palestinian liberation, that sort of thing. And so I think that's a key way to really link all of these various issues back to the war machine and how it functions generally. And then the second example that I did want to touch on as well is immigration and prisons, and in particular Homeland Security, because a lot of universities not only directly receive funding from ICE, they also have various partnerships with Homeland Security. I know, again, Northeastern had their president was a founding member of the Homeland Security Academic Advisory Council, which is tasked with bringing academic institutions in line with Homeland Security objectives. So they're very directly supporting and perpetuating the work that and the oppression that the Homeland Security and immigration and all of these areas of society are doing. And I think that ties into also prisons, because a lot of the private prison operators that that manage the facilities where immigrants are imprisoned are also operating the prisons that inmates are in as well. So that's another issue that it's possible to see some overlap and try to collaborate on, and so far as people are interested. And I think the other thing is that that I want to emphasize is that the U.S. uses and sees immigrants as cheap labor to abuse, harass, and treat as second-class citizens. And this is pretty much what the U.S. does abroad after and while it's dominating a country via economic or military domination. And so I think there's a very clear link there between abroad and home. And so it's my sense that folks working on those issues would also be, I think, in favor of working on opposing a military industrial complex and imperialism in general. And so I want to touch on a little bit about the history of student struggles, because I think there's a lot to learn there, in particular with the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam. Because while that was a very fierce movement to stop the war, also that movement was very linked up to feminist groups, gay liberation groups, and also was connecting the imperialist war the US was waging on Vietnam to the white supremacist and racist violence at home. And so all of those issues were interlinked and talked about together during that time, and not as these siloed things that have no relevance to each other. And I also think what was really inspiring about that time is that they really saw no use in politely just asking those in power to give their power up, because that's frequently the people in power won't do that. But instead, they saw the basis to demand and force the issue through various militant protests and the strikes that were held after the Kent State shooting, and so on and so forth. And so I think all of that bears a lot of relevance today, because with all the various issues that students are organizing on, whether it's Palestine, immigration, climate, it's the same forces that are profiting off of them in various boardrooms, in Congress. And so we really need to be linking up all of the people working on those issues to dismantle the system that upholds those. And I think the other element to trying to work with students as an outsider is that students, of course, really want to be working on important issues in society. And we clearly do not have a shortage of those. We need to do a lot of work on climate, transportation, healthcare, education, so on and so forth. But so many resources are wasted waging war. And so we really need to show students that by going to work for these various companies, whether it's a war profiteer or not, they're not truly contributing to the betterment of society. And I think most of them can be won over with that. And as we see right now with Pelosi's visit to China, the ruling elite, which contains both politicians and business people, are very arrogant, stupid, and decadent enough to play with the possibility of nuclear war. And so I think we need to see that to overcome the various forms of oppression that we see in society. We need to tackle that one system that supports it all, and work across various issues. So I'll stop there, but I have other thoughts that we can maybe get in about specifically how to work with student groups, maybe for the Q&A.
Okay, well, let's keep those in mind so we can get to those. Why don't we had a lot of information presented. I wonder if folks in the audience have questions you would like to ask any of our speakers.
If you do have questions, you can use the raise hand function instead of typing it all into the chat.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So if you could raise your hand, what we will do is unmute you so that you can ask your question. Nicholas, can you unmute Nicholas Cole?
Yeah, thank you. I'm very impressed with the amount of support that you have from your fellow students and recent graduates. And I was wondering, what do you find is the most effective way to approach students that you've been organizing? Do you hold teach-ins? Do you have webinars? Do you do leafleting at various places on the campus? Do you find most success with students who are studying certain subjects? Um, so that idea, your initial contact and how you go about that, I think might be helpful. Thank you.
Good question, Nicholas. Perhaps all three of our speakers might have a few thoughts on that important question.
Yeah, I can start on just a couple of different tactics that we used, but I'd say, definitely most of it was virtual, considering we were in the middle of a pandemic. We did do a lot of presentations to different groups of students, of course, student governance bodies, but we had a few other groups who and individuals in student government that we did that presentation to just several times over, just making sure everybody had thorough, relevant, accurate information. We have been using social media for a while as well, creating lots of infographics, just social media posts that are easily digestible and quickly digestible, but also not reductionist, and that provide kind of a good overview of the issue. We haven't done a ton of in-person activism, just with the pandemic, and then us kind of dispersing after graduation. I'm probably missing some things there, Rosie, if you can think of other ways that were particularly effective on our end.
Sure, yeah. I think a lot of the things that we had to keep in mind when we were launching this campaign was how to kind of stay in control of the narrative around what our demands were, because we were, very passionate about this issue, and we wanted to just straight up demand that this change. But I got help from my older brother, who works in sort of finance and consulting, and who helped us sort of retailor our presentation to UTIMCO to take a different voice, and present it more as a constructive, here's an opportunity for the university and for the president, who has come under fire recently, to do something that will sort of push the needle back towards oh, the university is doing something that's very kind and good for the world and in line with the students' desires. And so I think learning to take the confrontational tone that we have and keep that within students to students, because most students that we talk to in the sort of the government department, the Middle Eastern Studies department, my international relations and global studies fellow students, we obviously are very quick, and as Anna had said, there's so many of us who are very passionate about combating climate change and all of these different topics. But then when you talk to some people in the faculty council, who turned out to be all extremely supportive of us, but then people in the UTIMCO board of directors themselves, they have to be approached with this sort of tone that is not attacking them, because ultimately that's not going to be constructive. And we got more information out of them by going into the meeting without the sort of adversarial, we're phrasing it as demands and sort of phrasing it as asks instead. And so using that tactic, sort of tailoring what we were saying to students and tailoring what we were saying to our targets in UTIMCO and the Board of Regents, sort of allowed us to make more connections than if we had kept a one-size-fits-all sort of messaging strategy.
Great.
I'd say that I was just going to add that I think it's important also for what we found is that having students from various universities talking to each other and exchanging what's working, what's not, and understanding the particularities of each university has been, I think, a helpful thing. And in particular, a lot of us work together at MIT years ago, there was this College of Computing that was opened, which, that's obviously going to be a lot of the same sort of cybersecurity surveillance sort of thing. And at the ceremony for it, Henry Kissinger was there. And so there was a very large protest, and a lot of the MIT students actually came out to oppose that and learn more about the role MIT generally plays. And at that protest, one of the follow-up protests, we actually, I think a bunch of us, like 200 people, stormed up to the president's office, and it was really exciting. So that was a really great protest.
Thanks, Anna. Let's take a couple of questions here. Let's keep. We have Rachel Bliss next. Could we unmute Rachel? That's good. Go ahead, Rachel.
I have a son who works for the New York, their pension funds, and they have money invested in some companies that a lot of us aren't crazy about. Have you thought about, his impression is that if you keep these stocks, you can organize stockholders to bring about changes in the companies rather than leaving the companies altogether. Make your shareholders or organize them to perhaps transition out of weapons manufacturing or not building a certain type of fighter plane or getting out of nuclear weapons, where you try to advocate for different ways of controlling the company.
That's definitely a tactic that a lot of environmental advocates take when they're addressing investments in companies that are causing environmental damage. For our situation with UTIMCO, we think that that wouldn't be a very likely tactic that we could apply because they're really reluctant in the first place to even consider divestment because they don't want to make anything that has a social or political stance. And so expecting them to sort of be an advocate as a shareholder because of the fact that they own stocks and bonds in these companies is like a level beyond that. And we wouldn't expect them to be willing to do that just because of the makeup and the political leanings of the people who sit in the board of directors and the board of regents. And then on top of that, we would have to, differentiate because certain companies like Boeing, for instance, I think they get 29-30% of their revenue from weapons manufacturing sales, according to SIPRI. And the reason they were still one of our targets is because of the scale of their company and their revenue. They're still like a pretty big weapon manufacturing companies in terms of the sort of aerospace buildings of airplanes, but they could be maybe a target to build fewer airplanes and have fewer contracts with the military. And so Boeing and companies like Honeywell they create parts that are involved in, I think, like nuclear reactors and things like that, but they also create like ordinary appliances. And so that's another company that could sort of be advocated for that in that way. But some of them, those like top 6 names, which we are including as our priority targets, like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, so much of their like entire company is about selling weapons of war that we don't think there's any possible way they could change that without just becoming a different company and ceasing to exist. And so in that sense, there's not really any advocacy we could do to lead to their redemption. But that's a good question. So
thank you.
Yeah, I would just say the basis for these companies is the US government's and the ruling elite's quests to dominate the rest of the world. So unless that goes away, there's always going to be some sort of weapons manufacturers, some sort of war profiteers. That's sort of why they exist. So I don't see that as a way forward at it.
Okay, thanks everybody. Good question. Let's move on to Mike Schroer, and then I believe Subhash Gupta has a question. Let's go with Mike first.
You're muted, Mike.
Can we unmute Mike? Try again, Mike.
How about now?
Okay. There you go.
It sounded like you had some trouble with the engineering students. You said they got some misinformation that you had to work with, and you never did seem to get them turned around. Well, could you elaborate a little bit more on what that was and what the misinformation was and who was generating this? What was behind that problem? Why couldn't they see to get on board with you?
Sure. So there was a counter petition that was circulated in a very kind of informal, it was just a Google document, which there was this misinformation at the top of the Google document, and then there was a list of people's names as signed below. And this Google document counter petition didn't include a link to our joint resolution, so people could see for themselves what our bill was asking for. And so the authors of this counter petition, which was circulated among the College of Engineering, claimed that we were advocating for UT Austin, not the UTIMCO, endowment managers, but UT Austin to divest from these weapon manufacturing companies. And they were concerned that that was going to harm the university's relationships and recruiting relationships and jeopardize engineering students' ability to recruit at those companies. And so they were self-interestedly worried about, if I'm an aerospace engineering student and I want to later on work at Raytheon, that if UT Austin pursues this, that won't be possible for me anymore. And it was just total disinformation, because we weren't asking UT Austin to do anything. UT Austin doesn't manage the endowment, but rather UTIMCO does. And because of that relationship, these companies aren't going to stop trying to recruit students from UT Austin's engineering program because of the endowment managers making any decision about how they buy stocks or bonds. That's an entirely separate issue. And that is actually the issue which Anna works on, is, the recruiting and the lies which companies like Raytheon will present whenever they come to these career fairs. But because of that misinformation, it was authored and shared by that same one student who was just staunchly, passionately opposed to our resolution, because he was a far right sort of conservative and Zionist student who, I forget if he was a master's student. I think so. Or no, he was a
law school.
He was a law student. And so he had some friends who were circulating that petition. I think it gains between 1 and 200 signatures, but it didn't really succeed in sort of hindering the process of hearing the joint resolution in student government. So yeah, it was just something that kind of came out of left field, because we didn't know that there was going to be all of these fallacies we had to kind of make rebuttals against in our research, because as our name would suggest, we were very transparent about how we calculated the numbers that we put forth in our reports, and then citing all the different sources about the issues with these companies which we were targeting.
Okay, thanks. And thank you, Mike. Subhash Gupta, do you still have a question?
Okay, so there are a lot of information and it's quite impressive. So thank you very much for that. I have a question. Did you ever talk informally to one of the senior person in the university level, say registrar or dean or the president of the university? What they think about all this? Do they see any problem? Because they are getting funded, and that is how the university is run, and the students get job. If they are in a particular program. So there is always a temptation that it is much easier to get funds from the Department of Defense than any other department in the government. So I see that because of the huge fund from the Department of Defense, many of the universities get a lot of money from that. So where is the alternate source they will have? That have they said anything about that, or have you talked about that or discussed these things, anything like that with them?
Yeah, that's a good question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
We were not able to speak to the president of our university, Jay Hartzell, but we do know kind of where his politics stand. They actually welcomed the opening of a new sort of robotics lab on campus that is in partnership with the Army, or was it the Air Force or the Army Corps of Engineers? And we like interviewed in the campus newspaper explaining why this was a bad choice, and the ramifications of, like using robotics towards the military instead of just working on this as a way of research for other purposes because of the harm that goes along with militarizing technology. And so we aren't in contact with the president himself because we don't think that would be sort of productive. But I had spoken to the this is title, the sustainability director of University of Austin, University of Texas at Austin, and he and a lot of the other like faculty are sort of in alignment with the values and the desire that UTIMCO would not invest in these companies anymore, and that there would be fewer, like departmental funding and sponsorships from different branches of the military. And in terms of where the alternate funding would come from, there's sort of a growing, I guess, sector of more like environmentally focused startups and big firms that are more pivoting towards like research into sustainability. And so there are different labs which can also be funded by those kinds of companies. And so there are definitely alternatives and they have to be sought out. And if it were super easy and very beneficial, then people would be doing it already. So we think that it's something that we also have to just, advocate for. And it's definitely not something that's impossible.
Okay, thanks, Rosie. Anna or Lillian wanted to add anything to those comments? Okay, terrific. Cynthia, Paper Master is next. Cynthia, if you don't mind, just before your question, I do want to encourage people who live or are part of a group near a university to let us know if you might be interested in consider this type of work with students at that university near you. If you could put your that information in the chat with your with your email address, that would be great, because we'd like to get back to you to see what might be possible. As you can see, these folks in Texas have a lot of resources that they can make available to all of us, and we want to put people in touch with those resources. And so if you could just kind of make a note of that in the chat, that would be great. I have just put the link to the web page for the War Industries Resistors Network in the chat for anyone that wants to kind of check out a little bit in more detail just what our network is all about. Would like more people to join, obviously. So we want to stay in touch with people. We want to know what your idea, if you have some ideas, presentation of how to proceed working on campuses with student groups, put that in the chat too, and we'll kind of sift through this and see what comes out of that. So Cynthia, thanks for letting me put that in. Why don't you go with your question now?
Okay. I think I'm unmuted. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Well, just a brief comment and then a question for Rosie, I think, or Lillian. One of the strategies that we've talked about in WERN is reaching out to labor workers in the war industry to make common cause with them and to work for a transition from the war economy to a peace economy where their talents, whether they're engineers, people who manufacture things or whatever, can use those things in an industry that supports, life and peace rather than war. So that's one thing. And one more thing is that the strategy of getting shareholder proposals or shareholder resolutions with these companies does hold some promise, because I noticed that Lockheed's had shareholder proposals for the last couple of years. It's a Catholic group or something, and they get thousands of votes in favor of their resolutions pass. So I'm not saying that's the best way to go, but it's a way to raise awareness among the shareholders, and thousands of people see the resolutions. But my question is, what was the reaction from the Regents? I think you circled 3 names of people who were part of the Regents or the trustees of the university. What kind of reaction did you get from them? Thank you.
Yeah, I can take that. It's a very brief interaction. I was the one who spoke on their public meeting. Public comment, you're only allotted 3 minutes. They could have responded, they didn't have a response. So I just spoke very quickly. Ultimately, we weren't able to get in contact with any of them individually or personally because, there's just not contact information for them on the internet. They avoid, putting that information out there. And so it's very difficult to get in touch with any of the higher ups of the UT system. You're, constantly going to be going through, I don't know, like submission requests online for meetings or just, not finding that information. So we haven't been in contact with any of them in a personal capacity or any sustained dialogue. So that's something we're going to try to rev back up again. But yeah, it was just a brief 3-minute public comment period.
You had said that you identified 3 of them who had values similar to your own. Can you say more about that? What criteria were you looking at?
Right. Yeah, we had just kind of looked at their, previous positions that they held, any board memberships that they served on, any sort of, articles about them or their work. It was, for the most part, they were pretty all ideologically aligned. There were, no big outliers there, but we did have a little bit to work with. Some people mentioned they, liked renewable energy. So we're like, okay, we'll take what we can get. So it was slim pickings for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Jack and Felice. Jack, are you there? Felice? I think you're unmuted now. Still not hearing you. Gold, it keeps on throwing back onto mute. Okay, let's see if we can come back and go to Nicholas Moturn. Let's try to get back to you though, Jack and Felice. Nicholas?
Yeah, thank you. I have just a simple question. You mentioned using social media to communicate with students, and I was wondering what platforms you find are the most effective for that.
I think that we gained quite a lot of traction on Instagram by putting out a sort of infographic, like a series of slides that just sort of broke down what is UTMCO, why are they investing in these companies, like what are we trying to do about it? And then we also have Twitter, and those 2 are where we mostly interact with people like in our age demographic and fellow students. And Women for Open Straight Transparency also has LinkedIn, where we also share the same information and we'll post about our reports and our research.
Mm-hmm. Anna, would you say the same thing?
Yeah, I'd say Instagram and Twitter are I think the most popular.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot.
Sure.
Thanks, Nicholas. Just before we go back to Jack and Felice, I wanted to ask Anna, what arguments, what messages do your fellow students relate to most in terms of joining you?
Well, I'm not a student anymore, Paul, but I mean, it depends on the person, but I think, as I said, I think a key thing is the fact that these companies that are recruiting are doing a lot of harm and causing a lot of suffering. They're not doing what they're marketing themselves as. And so a lot of students want to be helping with societal problems, but are not if they go work for these companies. So having that exposed is, I think, a key thing to talk about. I don't know Lillian or Rosie, you would agree or have other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the biggest split we saw when interacting with students was like liberal arts versus STEM. I think, of course, just basic education differences between those two kind of college groups is just, of course, liberal arts students were more familiar with kind of what the issues were. And STEM is where we saw the most opposition. There was a lot of fear mongering there. Like, I mean, you're not going to be able to get a job if you say, support this in any way. It'll be on your record forever. But yeah, I think just talking about the larger global context and kind of like taking steps from there of like, okay, and this is how this works, and this is how your institution plays into that, I think was kind of a good way of breaking it down and presenting that.
Yeah, and I think also just the connections between, the military and what it does abroad, and then the oppression here. Like you were all talking about the 1033s, the military equipment transfers to the police. I talked a bit about surveillance, that sort of thing. So just connecting the dots makes people, I think, see more clearly why it's so relevant to oppose these companies and the war machine.
Okay, thanks. Let's see if Jack and Felice can get back on here. Want to give it another try, Jack? Felice?
I don't know what kind of problem they're having, but Jack has written his question in the chat. Do Anna or others have experience of recruiters promising potential recruits that they will not have to work on offensive weapons? They can work on solely defensive weapons.
No, but I would argue there's not a huge difference there actually, and that so-called defensive weapons are used offensively, and so I don't really see the distinction there as so meaningful.
Yeah, just speaking specifically about the ABM systems and things like that, and Biden making a distinction between offensive and defensive weapons in Yemen and all that type of stuff. We can't fall into that trap, I don't think. Thanks, Jack and Felice. Grace Barron Martinez, do you have a question?
Hey, thank you so much for the work you all are doing. Thinking about recruitment, we have a Raytheon facility being built in our community, and that's, when you talk about jobs, our community has very few jobs that pay a living wage and pay enough to survive where we live. I'm just curious what alternatives you are offering those people, because I personally, I'm 33 now, but I actually ended up working for a defense company that I didn't even realize until I was being an accountant and realized we had a whole, military unit, but I just am curious what alternatives are available, because I think that's the struggle in general, is finding a way to work in a job that doesn't compromise one's morals during these times.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to first leave the solutions part up to someone else. I don't know if anyone has a solution. I just wanted to say that absolutely, that's, the foundations on which this country is built is, employment for the purpose of exploitation. And I think you're going to be, it is systematic recruitment, and similarly with military recruitment, great benefits. It's a very, lucrative, enticing option for people. And so just wanted to kind of empathize and say, I don't necessarily think that individual people are the problem who are pressed for, living wage. but I think it's important that we kind of keep those structures in mind and how they cooperate and prop each other up. But yeah, again, on the solutions part, I'll turn it over to Anna.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think that is kind of the take home, and that should, I think, hopefully make us all question the general system that we're living under, where mostly everything is connected to something that's either doing oppressing people or some other aiding and abetting of that, because those are profitable, right? And so we live in a society that's structured around that. It's not that we don't have a whole host of other issues to solve, it's just that those aren't profitable. And so I think that's why we need to be thinking bigger picture, long term, about changing that, so that we don't have these qualms about our work.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks, Anna.
That's a big question. So I definitely, was just curious about that. But I think that you really touched on, Anna, how, most marginalized communities are the ones who are most often targeted with this recruitment as well. So I really appreciate centering that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think we're coming toward our now. Just mentioned that that WARIN, the War Industry Resisters Network, is very concerned about this issue of employment and how to relate to people that work for these companies. And we've had a webinar about that, and we are going to stay on that topic to try till we can try to figure this out. We've got some good connections with people in labor who are willing to dialogue with us about that. So keep tuned to further discussion about that issue. And I'll just say again, urge everybody that has some ideas about work with university, maybe working with a university near them, to share those ideas with us in the chat, to stay in touch with us. There will be an email going out to everyone who registered for this, giving you some links that may be helpful to you. Keep in mind some of the resources that were mentioned during the webinar tonight. I'll just ask one last question because I don't want to keep people too long, but I want to take advantage. These three women are here. The question is, it's a very concrete question. You are dealing with a public system in terms of this ownership of stock is by this entity that you're going after. Do you know if you're dealing with a private university, do they have to divulge what their stock holdings are? And in other words, you at least could find out what stock they held. Do you know how you would go about it with a private university, finding out just what stock they're holding? Because that's half the battle right there with a lot of these places.
Yeah, so we don't have obviously personal experience in pursuing that kind of information because we've been luckily the UT and the UT ecosystem is a public institution. And so we were able to attempt like open records requests for certain documents. And then we are linked up with different divestment campaigns, largely for like climate issues at different universities, and following their footsteps in looking at the different strategies they've taken, what worked and what didn't. So for example, fossil fuel divest Harvard, they recently had a victory, and that entailed filing a legal complaint with the Attorney General in sort of laying out the different ways in which the Harvard endowment, which is the largest in the country as it is private, is sort of violating their students' futures and going against the state mission and values because of how these investments are contributing to climate crisis and all of that. And so we're also considering that sort of avenue. And we would have to sort of ask them the steps they took to get like detailed information on the investments that the Harvard endowment has, because they're an example of a private endowment that obviously has all of that data, but it's not, to our knowledge, like posted on their website the way UTINCO's is for the permanent engagement fund.
That's what I thought. Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's great. I just wanted
I
to
would-
see. Go ahead, Anna. Do you want to say
Yes,
something?
I was just gonna say, I think it's virtually impossible to get it from a private university. I think I remember looking into some of the universities in Boston a few years ago, and you can't get a hold of it. But I think honestly, for me, the biggest thing with a divestment campaign or anything like that is the movement, right? That brings students into it, and gets them educated and thinking about these issues. And so, there's so many different ways to do that. So if there's not a direct way to, pull those funds, I think there's still various other ways.
Great. Okay, well, based on some of the interconnections between these issues that have been brought up by our speakers tonight, I think one strategy that our network is pushing is the idea of trying to link up with groups who are interested in a different issue from war companies. Maybe it's something about the border, maybe it's something about prisons, maybe it's something about climate, because these companies financially are interconnected in a lot of different ways. And to bring to those groups the idea that maybe if we work together, and go after these companies or stock ownership in companies that are both destroying human rights for Palestinians and lobbying for higher military budgets and making weapons and stuff like that, or making nuclear weapons, that those efforts could be strengthened by those campus efforts being connected up with groups in the community, like the groups that are in the War Industry Resistors Network. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Just because at a particular college there's nothing on war companies per se, there's probably something on another very important issue that could be where there might be collaboration, might be possible. It's been wonderful to have so many people joining us tonight. I just wonder, Ken Jones is one of the key people in the network. Ken, I wonder if you've got any last thought before we sign off.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Paul. This was a fabulous session. I want to thank you presenters. So great. And thank the organizers for putting this together. And yeah, good evening.
Okay, so let's stay in touch. Let's figure all this stuff out, okay? Because we've got a good target here. We've got where a lot of the power that's causing all this trouble in the world is located in these war companies. So let's try to keep at it. And thanks, everyone. Thanks, Anna and Lillian and Rosie, for joining us, and especially for all the work that you've been doing and all the resources you've been developing that we can all use. Okay, good night, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night.